I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary.
In Econ 101, we draw a graph to understand market. In the reality of 2025, economics move faster than the ink can dry. And if you aren't paying attention,
don't blink, you might miss it.
oh, don't panic. Today, I'm going to show you what Trump's tariffs mean for the trade between Taiwan and the United States. By the way, I'm Jinghua. You're now watching the first topic of my Econ 101 video presentation.
Let's get back to tariffs. A tariff is simply a tax on imports collected by customs. Economists generally dislike tariffs because they create debt-weight laws. And over the past half year, you've probably heard one adjective over your morning coffee: reciprocal. The main purpose of reciprocal tariffs is to address trade imbalances. Historically, in the aftermath of the Great Depression, the United States passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act in 1934. This ended the era of protectionism and moved the country towards liberalization by reducing reciprocal tariffs as a first step. It also established the institutional framework for U.S. trade policy for the rest of the 20th century, paving the way for general agreement on tariffs and trade, and later the WTO. But in Trump's second term, he reversed this trend. Like this, and this. Well, hold on. Let's first give President Trump a chance to explain his decision.
In short, chronic trade deficits are no longer merely an economic problem. They're a national emergency that threatens our security and our very way of life. It's a very great threat to our country. And for these reasons, starting tomorrow, the United States will implement reciprocal tariffs on other nations. It's been a long time since we even thought of that. We used to think about it a lot. We didn't think about it for many decades, and you see what's happened. For nations that treat us badly, we will calculate the combined rate of all their tariffs, non-monetary barriers, and other forms of cheating. And because we are being very kind, we're kind people.
As he just said, since the beginning of the second term this year, Trump has increased tariffs on U.S. imports from nearly all global partners, primarily invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. As time went on, different phases of this fair and reciprocal plan were introduced. However, in today's video, I'm not going to dive into every step, because honestly, we probably lose track on the negotiations. So let's narrow the scope down to Taiwan's case. As of August 7, 2025, the US imposed a 20% reciprocal tariff on Taiwan. Note that 20% is not the final tariff rate. Reciprocal tariffs are stacked on top of the existing most favored nation rates. Meanwhile, companies like TSMC, which have made major investments in the United States, receive exemptions, while many traditional industries, machinery, bicycle parts, and others fell victim to this restructured global trading system. From a competitive standpoint, this policy pushes many Taiwanese companies into hardship, as the 20% tariff is higher than what Japan and South Korea negotiated, 15%. Well, I agree the situation is a bit complicated. No pressure. Let's shift this messy reality back to the fundamental graphical analysis we learned in Econ 101. story begins with the concept of trade. Both import and export markets gain from trade. When Trump's reciprocal tariff hits, the world price rises and the trading volume shrinks. As you can see in all three panels of the trade model, the pre-tariff trade volume, represented by the blue rectangle, shrinks into the pink rectangle. In the United States market, the quantity demanded for imported goods falls as the world price rises from P to P plum. This gives more room for domestically produced goods to expand, which is the main purpose of a tariff. In addition, the US government collects tariff revenue, shown as the brown-colored rectangle. Regarding the net welfare effect, the total surplus decreases due to deadweight loss. Even though the government receives tariff revenue, consumer surplus shrinks, producer surplus increase. Crossing the Pacific Ocean, let's look at Taiwan. As the world price rises, the domestic price in Taiwan also increases. And the domestic equilibrium quantity falls. Both consumer surplus and producer surplus in the export market shrink. And therefore total surplus naturally declines. One more important point: Taiwanese firms do not benefit from the higher price abroad, because the price P plum is simply the original price plus the tariff. On top of reduced exports, negative consequences such as harm to export-focused industries, lower GDP, and possible increases in unemployment emerge, forcing the Taiwanese government to consider appropriate response strategies. Now, a critical question for policy. Why not a quota? Here you see the US import markets under both policies. Firstly, let's see the graph at the left-hand side. And we find the familiar shade box, which shows the funds the US government raises from tariffs. Now, move our attention to the right-hand side. We'll limit the quantity to the same level. The price still rises to P plum because supply is restricted. The difference is the government now gets zero revenue. Usually, the extra money, as known as the quota rent, goes to license holders. A country would prefer a quota over a tariff. A country would prefer a quota over a tariff when it needs an absolute break-proof limit on imports that foreign competitors cannot bypass through price cuts. Currency devaluation, or government subsidies. By creating a hard cap on quantity rather than just a cost penalty, quotas are often more effective at forcing foreign companies to reshore production, building factories inside the protected country to maintain their market access. Econ 101 tells us that tariffs are simply a tax on foreigners. However, Bloomberg points out the flaw in this logic. The effective tariff rate is lower than the headline number. Additionally, in reality, much of the added cost is absorbed by American manufacturers themselves. This brings us to Richard Baldwin's critique. He argues that these tariffs aren't designed to mathematically fix the economy. Instead, they are a form of emotional theater, created to validate the anger of the working class. But this narrative, one that paints the US trade deficit as a victim, misses something crucial. The fact that The US dollar serves as the global reserve currency, which makes which makes which makes persistent trade deficits both inevitable and in many ways advantageous. So why would Trump still make such a seemingly reckless decision despite the predictable consequences? According to financial analyst Yo-Ting Hao, this is actually a fiscal strategy. He argues that Trump is attempting to swap income tax revenue for tariff revenue. He describes Trump's overall economic framework as the three low, one high strategy: low taxes, low interest rates, low regulation, and high tariffs. When we place reciprocal tariffs into the broader context, Trump's intentions become clearer. Despite the risks and losses, his objective is to remove the restraints on American entrepreneurs and address the long-term problems caused by decades of trade deficits, industrial hollowing out, and rising unemployment. Based on these expert perspectives, I infer that Make America Great Again doesn't simply refer to restoring American global dominance. It also refers to rebuilding a complete industrial supply chain inside the United States. That is deeper greatness being pursued.
In conclusion, the taxpayer graph shows us the cost of tariffs, higher price, and deadly loss, but reality shows us the underlying strategy, using the cost to rewire the global supply chain. We are not witnessing a trade war, we are witnessing a global value chain war. This is Jinhua. Thanks for watching.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Econ News. I am Jinhua. Today we're going to talk about big news. TSMC, the high priest of semiconductor, have built new fabs in several places around the world. First, let's talk about how TSMC makes profit, especially since it holds a near monopoly position in the advanced semiconductor industry. This is the standard monopoly diagram. The firm determines its profit maximizing quantity at the point where the marginal cost curve intersects the marginal revenue curve. After choosing this quantity, the monopolist then charges the highest price consumers are willing to pay, which is found on the demand curve directly above that quantity. According to the graph, the monopoly price is P and the monopoly quantity is Q. The profit is the area of the orange rectangle, calculated as P minus ATC multiply quantity. To deepen our understanding, let's make some changes to the diagram. First, compared with perfect competition, the monopoly market creates deadweight loss, shown as the gray triangle. The reason is that unlike a free market, which produce at the socially efficient equilibrium, the monopolist restricts output to the profit maximizing level. Next, let's discuss how real-world factors like the surge in AI chip demand from companies such as NVIDIA and OpenAI shift the demand curve and affect price and output. When demand increases, the demand curve shifts outward from D to D plumb. Even though demand rises, a monopolist is a price maker, so it raises the price from P to P plumb while keeping the outputs the same. This reflects the monopolist's incentive to maximize profit, not social efficiency. Next, let's take a deeper look into TSMC's cost structure. There are two types of cost: fixed cost and variable cost. Fixed costs include factories, equipment, land, and long-term skilled labor, costs that do not change with output. Variable costs include raw materials, electricity, water, chemicals, hourly technicians, and maintenance that depends on production volume. Now that we've discussed these high fixed costs, let's consider how high fixed costs and economies of scale reinforce TSMC's natural monopoly characteristics. TSMC's fixed cost fabs, extreme ultraviolet machines, and R&D can cost tens of billions of dollars. This makes market entry extremely expensive. As for economies of scale, once TSMC has already built those multi-billion-dollar fabs, the average cost per chip becomes lower as output increases. This is because the huge fixed costs are spread over a very large number of chips, and production becomes more efficient at high volume. Return to the monopoly graph. As we mentioned earlier, economic profit is shown by the orange rectangle. The key is the average total cost curve because of TSMC's massive scale and high yield. Its ATC curve is extremely low. The vertical distance between the price P and the ATC forms a large supernormal profit rectangle. In perfect competition, such profits would attract new firms, reducing price and eliminating excess profits. But here, the barriers to entry, such as a 20 billion fab, are so high that new competitors cannot easily enter. This protects TSMC's profits in the long run. This brings us to our next point. TSMC has recently built new fabs in Arizona, Kumamoto, and Dresden. So, are these long-run decisions or short-run decisions? They are long-run decisions. In the short run, at least one input, such as capitals, factories, or major equipment, is fixed. But in the long run, all inputs are variable. Building a new fabs abroad requires purchasing new land, constructing new facilities, and installing new machinery. So these are clearly long-run choices. Moreover, high fixed costs shape TSMC's decisions in several ways. They force TSMC to plan for the long run very carefully. Economies of scale only occur at extremely large outputs, which encourages TSMC to continue expanding. Last, high fixed costs discourage new entrants, reinforcing TSMC's natural monopoly-like structure. Finally, if Intel, Samsung are able to produce 2 to 3 nanometer chips in the future, what would the impact be on TSMC? When only one firm exists in the market, like TSMC today, we call this structure a monopoly. A monopoly sets the highest price, the lowest output, and has the strongest market power. But if more than one firm competes, the market becomes an oligopoly. In an oligopoly, prices fall, output increases, and market power weakens. TSMC would still be a major player, but it would no longer have near monopoly influence over the most advanced process nodes.
And this is for today's news. I'm Jinhua. See you next time.
Hello everyone, I'm Cynthia from the group A44.
So now we're going to talk about negative externalities. To better understand the case, we choose a real-world example of plastic waste recycling industry in the documentary called Plastic China. Before we get started, let's watch a small clip. So, what kind of externalities are generated in the industry? We divided them into 5 aspects: environmental, health, social, educational, international, and racial. So the first one, environmental, the negative externalities are water pollution from untreated water, air pollution from burning plastics, soil contamination, long-term ecological damage, and reduction in local biodiversity. The next one is health. The negative externalities are respiratory disease from toxic fumes, skin and eye irritation, cancer risks, exposure to microplastics and chemicals. Okay, the third one is social and educational. So we know in the documentary the children, they don't have opportunity to get education, and because their family are low income households, so they stuck in the poverty cycle, which have a negative impact on social mobility. And the fourth one is international externalities. So the rich countries will export their waste to developing countries, and the poor country will import to increase their country's income. And that leads to global inequality to pollution distribution. The final one is racial externalities. We know the people in the factory, they are often 彝族, which are poorer than Han-Ren, since Han-Ren don't even want to have that kind of job to recycle plastic. Okay, so next you might ask, who are the producers and victims in these externalities? We also separate them into several aspects: global, individual, and industry. So for the first one, who are the producers in the global aspect? There are rich countries that export plastic waste to developing countries, and the victims are developing countries that import plastic waste to increase their country income. The second one is individual aspect. The producers in this aspect are consumers from rich countries who overuse plastics and don't do the proper recycle, and the victims, they are workers and residents from the factory or live nearby the factory. The final one is industry level, and the producers in the industry level are plastic manufacturer and packaging companies use single-use plastics or package excessively, like coupon. And the victims, they are steel workers and residents live or nearby the factory. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the second part, graphical analysis. This is the company's private supply curve, And we know that there is an external cost between the social cost and private cost. So we add this up and we'll get the social supply curve. And here's our demand curve. So we can find the equilibrium of both of them. First, let's look at the private one. The equilibrium quantity is QS and the equilibrium price is PS. Next, let's look at the social one. The equilibrium quantity is QS prime and the equilibrium price is PS prime. So through this graph, we can see that there's a difference between QS and QS prime. Why market produces too much pollution without government's intervention? Let us use the graph to explain why. So as you can see, the original supply curve, which is the company's private supply curve, doesn't need to bear the responsibility of external cost. So they produce things as the supply curve I make a check on. Thus causing the QS is bigger than the QS prime in the picture. Okay, next we're going to identify the deadweight loss area. So here the yellow area shows a private total surplus at the private equilibrium. But because the private supply doesn't include the external cost, which is the purple parallelogram, as we know from the previous information, the difference between QS and QS prime represents the amount of overproduction, and the welfare loss from this overproduction is the deadweight loss, which is the purple triangle here. And under these circumstances, we can say that both producers and consumers gain in the presence of negative externalities, since producers produce more and earn more profit, and the consumers get a lower price and can buy more, but the society as a whole losses. So how does the deadweight loss represent the inefficiency? To put this simply, we can say that is because it measures the extra production that harms society more than it helps. Those traits shouldn't happen, and the triangle shows how big the loss is. After we're talking about the externalities, let's talk about how to correct the market failure. There are several ways like quantity regulation, price regulation, tradable permits, and information disclosure. First one, the quantity regulation. The pros of it is the emission amount is fixed, and the cons are it is not that flexible. Firms stop innovations when they get to the limit. And the most important one is that it is hard to evaluate. The second one is the price regulation. The pros of firms have continuous incentives to innovate, and the government can earn tax revenue. For the cons, it's like the quantity regulation. The rate is hard to set, and it also sometimes can be politically sensitive. So we talk about the tax in the price regulation. The tax is called Pigouvian tax. Pigouvian taxes can let the firms to take account of the social costs arise from the negative externality. Thus, their own incentives will guide them to produce a socially efficient amount. The tax will be set to equals to the external cost. Based on the previous information, the tax is set to be equals to the external cost. Thus, the supply curve will shift to the social cost 1, and the equilibrium quantity is QS prime. The equilibrium price is PS prime. So it shows how the tax shifts the marginal private cost to reach the socially optimum equilibrium. The third one is tradable permits. The pros are it is efficient, and like the quantity regulation, the pollution amount is fixed. For the cons, the price of permits can sometimes fluctuate, and it requires a well-designed monitored market. The last one is the information disclosure. The pros are its cost is low and easy to implement. The consumers can make better choice, and the firms care about because of the reputation. For the cons, our information disclosure needs consumers care about the issues, and it doesn't mean the guarantee. So, for example, it's like the other countries asking TSMCs to do for the environmental issue right now. There are several solutions the government can provide, such as charging taxes, imposing quota, or implementing tradable permits. In our case, Plastic China, the China government intervenes in this situation by enacting a law to ban the import of plastic waste in 2017. Was it effective? And what are the challenges? I would say it was effective, though the information from China wasn't that transparent. But so far we know was that the village in the documentary had all quit the job of recycling the waste plastics. And for the challenges, there are challenges from global aspect, the livelihood of those workers, and the black market. So the first one, global aspect, the challenges are where should the plastics go? And for the second, livelihood of the workers, how should they find the next job? And the final one, black market, is there might be some illegal trades of recycling. The international externalities happens when the actions of one country cause pollution or damage that another country has to suffer. And the other one is that pollution may be authored in the places that are not categorized into which country's territory, like Pacific Ocean. I would say that international cooperation can serve as a Pigouvian mechanism, since we know that there are some discussion in COP30 to talk about the polluter pays system, which is similar to the Pigouvian taxes idea.